You got a call sign, old man? Or did you just wander in here looking for free coffee? The voice carried easily across the canvas walls of the briefing tent, sharp with amusement and just loud enough to turn a few heads. Captain Mason Reed stood near the folding table at the center of the tent, a tall Marine in crisp utilities with the kind of confidence that came from rank, youth, and a career that had so far moved exactly the way he planned. Around him, clusters of Marines and civilian visitors drifted between displays set up for the base's annual open house. Maps, unit patches, old photographs from campaigns most of the younger Marines only knew from training manuals. Reed wasn't looking at any of that. His attention had fixed on the old man sitting quietly on a metal chair near the edge of the tent. The man looked completely out of place, and yet strangely comfortable there, as if the hum of military voices and the smell of canvas and dust were familiar ground. He was somewhere in his late 70s or early 80s, lean but solid, with weathered hands resting loosely on his knees. A faded denim jacket hung from his shoulders, the kind that had seen decades of sun and rain. His gray hair was cropped short, and his pale blue eyes watched the room with calm patience, as if nothing around him needed to be rushed. Reed tilted his head slightly, studying him the way an officer studies a situation that doesn't quite add up. "Sir," he continued, the words shaped more by habit than respect, "this area is restricted during the briefings. Visitors are supposed to stay near the exhibit tables." A few Marines nearby slowed their conversation, sensing the edge creeping into Reed's tone. The old man turned his head slowly toward him. There was no confusion in his expression, no embarrassment at being called out. Just that same steady calm. "I'm fine where I am," the old man said quietly. His voice was rough with age, but even, the kind of voice that didn't try to compete with noise, but somehow carried anyway. Reed gave a short laugh under his breath. Confidence like that from someone dressed like a retired mechanic didn't sit right with him. He stepped closer, boots thudding lightly against the plywood floor. As he did, something on the old man's wrist caught his eye. A length of worn olive drab paracord wrapped loosely around it like a bracelet. Threaded into the knot was a small piece of blackened metal, scratched and dull, no bigger than a quarter. It looked like a scrap from some forgotten piece of equipment. Reed leaned forward slightly, curiosity sharpening his grin. "That's some kind of souvenir?" he asked, nodding toward the bracelet. A couple of younger Marines nearby chuckled quietly. The old man glanced down at his wrist for a moment, his thumb brushing lightly over the dark piece of metal as if it had been there so long he barely noticed it anymore. Then he looked back up. "Something like that," he said. Reed folded his arms. The answer only made him more certain the old man didn't belong here. Maybe a veteran who'd wandered in from the visitor lot. Maybe someone who liked to tell stories about the old days. Either way, Reed had a tent full of Marines watching, and a captain didn't let a moment like that pass without a little theater. He shifted his weight, voice lifting just enough for the surrounding group to hear. "All right then," he said with a crooked smile. "If you're going to sit in a Marine briefing tent like you belong here, you must have had a call sign at some point." The old man didn't react right away. His eyes moved slowly across the tent, the rows of folding chairs, the Marines in pressed uniforms, the flags hanging from the support poles. Then they settled back on Reed. The calm in that gaze didn't change at all. And somehow, for just a fraction of a second, Captain Mason Reed had the strange feeling that he had just asked a question he wasn't ready to hear answered. Captain Mason Reed waited for the old man to answer, but the tent remained strangely quiet, as if the air itself had slowed down to listen. The old man did not rush. His thumb moved once across the worn paracord around his wrist, feeling the edge of the dark metal piece threaded into it. Then his hand settled again on his knee. Up close, the bracelet looked even older than Reed first thought. The cord had faded from deep olive green to a pale grayish color, the fibers softened by decades of sweat, rain, and sun. The metal fragment held, and the knot was not decorative. It was dull and uneven, scratched in a way that suggested it had once belonged to something else entirely. Reed noticed the detail and tilted his head slightly. "That bracelet looks like it has been through more deployments than half this tent," he said with a faint smirk. A couple of younger Marines, standing near the map board, chuckled under their breath. They had been drifting closer during the exchange, drawn by the same instinct that pulls soldiers toward any moment where authority meets defiance. The old man followed Reed's gaze to his wrist again, almost thoughtfully. It has been around a while, he said. His voice carried no pride in it, no attempt to impress anyone. It was simply a statement. Reed leaned one shoulder against the table behind him, adopting the relaxed posture of someone completely in control of the moment. He could feel the attention in the tent building now. Conversations at the far end had softened. Even the civilian guests near the display boards were glancing over, curious about the quiet confrontation unfolding in the center of the Marine briefing tent. You served then, Reed said. It was not really a question. The old man nodded once. Reed studied him again, this time with a little more focus. The man's jacket was old but clean. His boots were worn in a way that suggested miles rather than neglect. His posture was relaxed but straight, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime sitting through long briefings and longer nights. Still, none of it matched the setting in Reed's mind. The base had invited veterans for the open house, but most of them wore hats from old units, jackets with embroidered patches, or pins that announced who they had been. This man carried none of that, just the bracelet and that steady quiet. Reed spread his hands slightly, his grin returning. Well, if you served, you know how this works, he said. Marines do not just sit around without a story attached to them. Another ripple of laughter moved through the small group of Marines nearby. Reed nodded toward the bracelet again. That little piece of metal looks like it came from something important. Maybe a radio, maybe a bird, maybe something that stopped working at the worst possible moment. The old man's pale blue eyes rested on Reed again. For a brief second something passed across them, not irritation, not pride, but the faint shadow of memory moving behind calm water. Then it was gone. Sometimes things break, he said quietly. Sometimes they still help you remember. Reed pushed himself off the table and stepped closer, boots thudding softly against the plywood floor. The distance between them was now less than 6 feet. Close enough for Reed to see the fine lines around the old man's eyes and the faint scar along one knuckle that had long since faded into the map of his skin. Reed folded his arms again, the captain's insignia on his collar catching the overhead light. All right, he said, voice lifting slightly so the group around them could hear every word. If you were really out there, then you had a call sign. Everybody did. The tent seemed to lean toward the moment. The old man remained perfectly still, his gaze steady. Reed smiled again, the kind of smile officers sometimes use when they are certain the next move belongs to them. So let us hear it, he said. What was your call sign? Captain Mason Reed expected hesitation, maybe an awkward laugh, maybe a vague answer about a supply unit or a maintenance crew from a war long finished. That was usually how these moments ended. Veterans who wandered into base events often enjoyed telling stories, but their voices always carried a certain eagerness, a need to be believed. The old man in the chair did not look eager at all. He simply sat there, hands resting loosely, shoulders relaxed beneath the faded denim jacket. The quiet around him felt heavier now, as if the air inside the tent had settled around his silence. Reed waited another second, then another. What is the matter? He asked lightly. Trying to remember? A few of the Marines nearby laughed again, but the laughter sounded thinner than before. Reed could feel the eyes on him now, not just from the group around the map table, but from across the tent as well. Moments like this had a way of pulling attention the way a magnet pulls loose metal. The old man finally moved. It was not a dramatic gesture. His right hand lifted slightly from his knee and rested again on the bracelet around his wrist. His thumb brushed across the small black fragment tied into the cord, tracing the edge of it slowly. The movement was almost absent-minded, but something about it felt deliberate. Reed watched it with mild curiosity. That thing must have quite a story, he said, nodding toward the bracelet again. Looks like it came off a piece of gear that stopped working at the worst possible moment. The old man's eyes shifted down to the metal fragment. For a moment his gaze unfocused slightly, as if he were looking through it instead of at it. When he spoke again his voice was softer, but the words carried easily through the tent. It came from a radio, he said. Reed raised an eyebrow. A radio? The old man nodded once. Field radio. Old one. Heavy as a toolbox and about as reliable. Reed gave a short amused breath through his nose. Let me guess, he said. You carried it up a hill somewhere, and the thing quit on you. Another ripple of quiet amusement moved through the Marines nearby. But the old man did not smile. His thumb rested against the metal fragment for another second before his hand dropped back to his knee. "It stopped working," he said simply. Reed noticed that the old man did not add anything else. No long story. No attempt to draw the room into the memory. Just that one sentence. Reed tilted his head again, studying him with a little more focus now. Something about the man's calm was beginning to feel less like stubbornness and more like patience. The kind of patience someone develops after years of watching younger men rush ahead of their own understanding. Reed pushed the thought away. He straightened slightly and glanced around at the small circle of Marines who had gathered within 10 feet of the exchange. "All right," he said with a grin that returned a bit of sharpness to the moment. "You carried a radio. That means somebody was calling you something over that radio." His eyes returned to the old man. "Everybody had a call sign," he said. "Pilots, recon teams, forward observers. Nobody used real names when things mattered." The tent seemed even quieter now. Somewhere outside, the distant rumble of a truck engine rolled across the parade ground. But inside the canvas walls, every ear seemed tuned to the same small space in the center of the floor. Reed stepped a half step closer, his voice calm, but carrying an edge of challenge now. "So I will ask one more time," he said. "What was yours?" The old man lifted his head fully then. His pale blue eyes met Reed's without hurry, without irritation, and without the slightest sign of embarrassment. For a moment, he simply studied the young Marine captain standing in front of him, as if measuring the weight of the question. Then he spoke 2 quiet words. "Iron Viper." For a brief second nothing happened. Reed's grin froze halfway across his face. Not because the name sounded impressive, but because somewhere behind him a chair leg scraped sharply across the plywood floor as someone suddenly stood up. The sound was small, but in the silence of the tent it echoed like a dropped wrench. And Captain Mason Reed realized that someone in the room had just reacted to that name in a way he did not understand. The sound of the chair scraping across the plywood floor pulled every eye in the tent toward the back row. A tall Marine staff sergeant had risen halfway from his seat before he seemed to catch himself. His hand rested on the edge of the folding chair, knuckles tight against the metal frame. For a moment he did not speak. He simply stared at the old man sitting calmly across the tent. Captain Mason Reed followed the direction of the sudden movement and frowned slightly. "Problem, Staff Sergeant?" Reed asked. The staff sergeant straightened a little, but the expression on his face had changed in a way Reed did not immediately understand. It was not anger. It was not amusement either. It was the look of someone who had just heard a word that did not belong in an ordinary conversation. "No, sir," the Marine said quickly, though his voice carried a tension that had not been there before. He glanced once more toward the old man, then looked back to Reed. "Just adjusting the chair." Reed held his gaze for a moment longer, then shrugged faintly and turned back toward the man in the denim jacket. "Well," Reed said lightly, "that is a dramatic reaction for a call sign." A few Marines chuckled again, but the laughter did not travel as far this time. The staff sergeant slowly lowered himself back into his seat, though his attention never left the old man near the center of the tent. Reed did not notice the way the Marine's hand moved quietly toward the small radio clipped at his belt. The old man remained exactly as he had been before. Calm. Still. His pale blue eyes rested on Reed as if the reaction behind him had nothing to do with him at all. Reed studied him for another second. "Iron Viper," he repeated with a faint grin. "That sounds like something out of an old movie." He folded his arms again. "Recon team." The old man said nothing. Reed tilted his head slightly. "Helicopter crew?" Still nothing. The silence was not defensive. It simply existed, like a wall Reed could not quite push through. Reed exhaled softly through his nose and glanced around the tent again, making a small show of the moment. "You know," he said, raising his voice slightly so the nearby Marines could hear him clearly. "I have heard a lot of impressive call signs over the years. Most of them come with a story attached." His eyes returned to the old man. Usually a long one. The old man's gaze did not waver. Reed took a step to the side, circling slightly as if examining a piece of equipment from a different angle. The movement brought him closer to the bracelet on the old man's wrist again. The black metal fragment caught a small shaft of afternoon light pushing through the canvas seam above them. Reed pointed toward it once more. "That radio piece," he said. "That came from the same mission that gave you that call sign?" The old man followed his glance down to the small piece of metal. For a brief moment his thumb brushed it again, slow and thoughtful. Yes, he said quietly. Reed nodded once as if confirming his own assumption. Thought so. Behind him, the staff sergeant had turned slightly in his chair. One hand now rested near the small handheld radio clipped at his belt. His thumb hovered just above the push button. He did not speak into it yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and whispered something to the Marine sitting beside him. The younger Marine frowned and whispered back, clearly confused. Reed remained focused on the old man, unaware of the quiet exchange unfolding 10 feet behind him. So let me get this straight, Reed said with easy confidence. You carried a broken radio. You picked up a call sign that sounds like it belongs in a classified file, and now you just happened to wander into a Marine briefing tent during open house. His smile widened faintly. That is a pretty good story. The old man did not return the smile. Reed noticed that detail, and for the first time a small thread of curiosity slipped through his certainty. Because the man did not look like someone telling a story. He looked like someone remembering one. And behind Reed, the staff sergeant finally pressed the button on his radio and spoke quietly into it. Command desk, he murmured under his breath, careful that his voice did not carry across the tent. I need you to run a call sign check. There was a pause as a voice answered through the faint static. The staff sergeant glanced once more toward the old man before finishing the message in a low voice. Call sign is Iron Viper. The faint crackle of the radio against the staff sergeant's shoulder was almost lost beneath the quiet murmur of the tent, but to him it sounded louder than it should have. He turned slightly away from the group, lowering his voice even further. Command desk, he repeated softly. I need confirmation on a legacy call sign. Static answered him for a moment, followed by a calm voice on the other end. Go ahead. The staff sergeant glanced again toward the center of the tent, where Captain Mason Reed still stood in front of the old man. Reed was speaking again, his tone relaxed, almost playful, unaware of the small ripple that had begun to move through the room. The staff sergeant pressed the radio closer to his mouth. Call sign is Iron Viper. For a moment there was nothing but static. Then the voice on the other end changed. Not louder, just sharper. Repeat that call sign. The staff sergeant felt the small hairs on the back of his neck rise. Iron Viper, he said again quietly. The pause that followed was longer this time. Across the tent, Reed continued speaking, his voice carrying lightly as he gestured toward the worn piece of metal tied into the old man's bracelet. You know, Reed was saying, most stories get bigger with time. Radios that stopped working become radios that save the day. A few Marines smiled politely at the remark. The old man did not react. His eyes rested calmly on Reed, the same patient stillness in his expression as before. The command desk voice returned through the radio, quieter now. Stand by. The staff sergeant swallowed once. He had been in the Marine Corps long enough to recognize that tone. The tone that appeared when a routine question stopped being routine. He shifted slightly in his chair, keeping the radio angled away from Reed so the captain would not hear the exchange. Reed was still studying the old man, his curiosity now mixed with the faintest edge of skepticism. Iron Viper, he repeated again, almost testing the sound of it. That name sounds like it came out of a Cold War briefing room. He gave a small shrug. But I have been wrong before. The old man tilted his head a fraction, as if acknowledging the possibility without confirming it. His hand moved once more to the bracelet around his wrist. The metal fragment caught another thin ray of afternoon light pushing through the seam in the canvas roof. Reed noticed the way the man touched it again. Not nervously, not proudly, just as if the small piece of metal held a memory that did not need to be explained. Reed's grin softened slightly. You know, he said, most veterans who come through here bring photos or unit patches. Something that proves where they have been. The old man looked down at the metal piece again. Some things do not need to prove anything, he said quietly. Reed was about to respond when the staff sergeant's radio crackled again. The Marine straightened instantly. Staff Sergeant, the voice said, no longer casual. Where are you right now? Briefing Tent 3, he answered. Open house event. There was another pause. When the voice returned it carried a new weight entirely. Do not move the individual you just mentioned. The staff sergeant's grip tightened around the radio. Copy, he said carefully. Confirming. The voice continued slowly. The call sign Iron Viper appears in a restricted archive file associated with a reconnaissance unit operating more than 40 years ago. The staff sergeant felt his pulse quicken slightly. Understood. Remain where you are, the voice said. Command is reviewing the record now. The radio went quiet again. The staff sergeant lowered it slowly, his eyes moving back toward the center of the tent. Captain Mason Reed was still standing there with relaxed confidence, completely unaware that the simple question he had asked a few minutes earlier had just reached far beyond the canvas walls of the briefing tent. And the old man with the faded denim jacket still sat exactly the same way he had from the beginning, calm and patient, as if he had spent an entire lifetime waiting for moments like this to catch up with him. Captain Mason Reed sensed the shift in the room before he understood it. It was subtle at first, the kind of change that happens when conversation slows without anyone realizing why. A few Marines near the back of the tent had stopped smiling. One of them was watching the old man with a quiet intensity that did not match the casual tone Reed had set only minutes earlier. Reed followed the direction of that attention for a moment, then looked back at the man seated in front of him. The old veteran had not moved at all. His posture remained relaxed, shoulders slightly forward, hands resting loosely on his knees. The faded denim jacket looked even older under the muted afternoon light filtering through the canvas ceiling. Reed cleared his throat softly and gave a small shrug, as if brushing away the strange tension he had begun to feel. Well, he said lightly, Iron Viper is certainly a memorable name. His voice carried easily across the tent again, but the response he expected did not come. No easy laughter. No quiet agreement. Just silence and the faint rustle of canvas in the breeze outside. Reed tilted his head slightly, studying the old man once more. You know, he continued, most people who come through here like to explain their stories, especially if they have a call sign like that. The old man met his gaze calmly. Stories explain themselves eventually, he said. Reed let out a soft breath through his nose. That answer was not defensive. It was not boastful either. It was simply settled, and that unsettled Reed more than he wanted to admit. Behind him, the staff sergeant shifted slightly in his chair. His radio rested loosely in his hand now, but his eyes remained fixed on the old man. The quiet instruction from the command desk still echoed in his mind. Do not move the individual. That was not language used. For ordinary situations. Reed noticed the movement behind him and glanced back briefly. Everything good back there, Staff Sergeant? He asked. The Marine nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Reed studied him for half a second longer before turning back to the old man again. All right, he said, folding his arms again with a faint smile that tried to restore the earlier confidence in the moment. Let us say that call sign is real. He gestured toward the bracelet on the old man's wrist. And let us say that radio piece really did come from some operation that mattered. He leaned forward slightly, curiosity now stronger than mockery. What happened to the radio? The old man glanced down again at the small piece of dark metal tied into the faded cord. His thumb brushed it once, slowly, almost thoughtfully. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but somehow clearer in the still air of the tent. It stopped transmitting, he said. Reed waited for the rest of the explanation. It did not come. The old man simply lifted his eyes again. Reed blinked once, then chuckled softly. That is it, he asked. The old man nodded. Reed shook his head with a faint smile. That might be the shortest war story I have ever heard. But as he said it, something else caught his attention. Across the tent entrance, 2 Marines had just stepped inside with quick, purposeful strides. They were not part of the open house staff. Their uniforms carried the quiet authority of headquarters personnel, and their eyes scanned the interior of the tent with immediate focus. One of them spoke quietly into a handheld radio as they walked. Reed noticed them and frowned slightly. The open house event had dozens of visitors moving through the base all afternoon, but the way these 2 Marines entered the tent did not look casual at all. They stopped near the entrance and looked directly toward the center of the room, toward the old man. Reed straightened slowly. The staff sergeant behind him had already gone still again, watching the same 2 Marines. Reed felt the first real thread of uncertainty slip into his thoughts. Because the 2 Marines had not come into the tent looking for him. They had come looking for the quiet, old veteran sitting in the folding chair with a worn bracelet and a call sign that had suddenly traveled far beyond a simple conversation. The 2 Marines who had entered the tent moved with quiet purpose, their boots steady against the plywood floor, their attention locked on a single point near the center of the room. Captain Mason Reed watched them approach, the faint crease between his eyebrows deepening as he tried to understand what had just shifted. Headquarters personnel did not normally walk into a casual open house briefing like this unless something had gone wrong. The first Marine stopped about 10 feet away, his posture straight, his expression controlled in a way that suggested he had already confirmed something important. He glanced once toward the staff sergeant in the back row, who gave the smallest nod in return. Reed noticed the exchange immediately. The second Marine spoke quietly into his radio again, his voice low enough that the words did not carry across the tent, but the tone was unmistakably formal. Around them, the Marines who had gathered for the open house had begun to sense the same shift Reed felt. Conversations had completely stopped now. The tent that had been full of casual voices only minutes earlier felt suddenly smaller, quieter, the air heavy with attention. Reed turned halfway toward the two incoming Marines. "Can I help you?" he asked. The question came out calm, but it carried the natural authority of a captain addressing unfamiliar movement inside his briefing area. The first Marine met his eyes briefly. "Negative, sir," he said respectfully. "We are just confirming a detail." Reed's frown deepened slightly. "A detail about what?" The Marine's gaze moved past him toward the old man seated in the folding chair. Reed followed the line of that look and felt the faintest ripple of unease move through his thoughts. The old veteran had not reacted at all to the arrival of the two Marines. He remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, hands resting loosely, eyes calm. If anything, he looked like the only person in the tent who already knew how this moment would unfold. The first Marine took a slow step forward. Not aggressive, not hurried, just deliberate. "Sir," he said quietly, addressing the old man now rather than Reed. "May I confirm your name?" Captain Mason Reed blinked once in surprise. The question had bypassed him completely. The old man lifted his eyes toward the Marine and answered without hesitation. "Caleb Warren." The name seemed to settle into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. The Marine nodded once, as if that answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. He reached to the small tablet clipped to his belt and glanced at the screen for a brief moment. Then he looked back at the old man again. Reed crossed his arms slowly, his curiosity now mixed with something sharper. "Is there a reason headquarters personnel are verifying a visitor in the middle of a public event?" he asked. The Marine turned slightly toward him again. His voice remained respectful, but there was a quiet gravity behind it now. "Sir, we are simply following a command desk request." Reed felt the thread of uncertainty tighten just a little more. Behind him, the staff sergeant remained very still, watching every second of the exchange. Reed looked back at the old man again. The veteran's pale blue eyes had shifted toward the tent entrance, where faint sunlight spilled through the canvas flap and across the floor. He looked thoughtful, but not surprised. Reed exhaled slowly and let his arms fall to his sides. "All right," he said. "Since everyone suddenly seems interested in this conversation, maybe someone would like to explain why." The Marine near the entrance spoke into his radio one more time, his voice almost a whisper. "Command desk, confirmation received. Name is Caleb Warren." There was a pause of only 2 seconds before the answer returned through the radio. The Marine's posture straightened immediately. He looked toward the tent entrance again, as if expecting something to appear there at any moment. And Captain Mason Reed realized that whatever had started as a simple question about a call sign had now reached someone far higher in the chain of command. The reply that came through the radio was so quiet that only the Marine holding it could hear the first words clearly, but the change in his posture was immediate. His shoulders straightened, and the casual stillness in the tent seemed to tighten another degree. "Stand by," the voice from command said again, this time sharper than before. "Senior command has been notified." The Marine lowered the radio slowly, exchanging a brief look with the second headquarters Marine beside him. Neither of them spoke out loud, but the message between them was clear. Something far above a routine verification had just been triggered. Captain Mason Reed watched the exchange carefully now. The earlier confidence in his posture had not disappeared, but it had shifted. Curiosity had turned into something closer to caution. He looked once more at the old veteran sitting quietly in the folding chair. Caleb Warren had not changed at all. He remained calm, the same relaxed posture, the same steady gaze that had unsettled Reed from the beginning. The faint afternoon light filtering through the canvas roof rested across the worn denim of his jacket and the faded cord around his wrist. Reed studied the bracelet again. That small fragment of metal tied into the paracord suddenly seemed less like a souvenir and more like something that had traveled through time. Reed cleared his throat slightly. "All right," he said slowly. "Someone clearly knows something I do not." His voice was controlled, but the room could hear the edge of tension beneath it now. One of the headquarters Marines glanced toward him respectfully, but did not answer. Instead, he stepped half a pace closer to Caleb Warren. "Sir," he said carefully, "we have received confirmation from the command desk regarding the call sign you mentioned." Reed felt the quiet ripple pass through the room again. The old veteran lifted his eyes toward the Marine, acknowledging him with a small nod, but saying nothing. The Marine continued. "The record indicates that call sign was associated with a long-range reconnaissance element operating several decades ago." Reed folded his arms slowly again, though this time the gesture looked more thoughtful than confident. "Several decades," he repeated. The Marine nodded once. "Yes, sir." Reed glanced back toward Caleb Warren. The old man met his gaze calmly, offering no correction and no explanation. Reed exhaled softly. That still does not explain why command desk suddenly cares about it. The second Marine's radio crackled again before either of them could answer. The Marine lifted it instantly. "Command desk." A voice came through the speaker, firmer now, carrying unmistakable authority even through the faint static. "Confirm location of the individual identified as Caleb Warren." "Briefing Tent 3, the Marine replied. There was a pause of less than a second. Then the voice answered again. "Remain in position. Senior command is inbound." The Marine lowered the radio slowly. Even without repeating the words out loud, the meaning had already spread across the room through body language alone. The two headquarters Marines stepped slightly to the side, their attention shifting toward the entrance of the tent. The staff sergeant in the back row straightened again in his chair. Several of the younger Marines near the display boards exchanged uncertain glances. Captain Mason Reed followed their eyes toward the open flap of the canvas entrance. Outside, the bright afternoon sunlight spilled across the gravel path running between the temporary tents set up for the open house event. For a moment nothing happened. Then the faint sound of approaching boots on gravel carried through the air. Not hurried, not chaotic, just steady, purposeful steps moving directly toward the tent. Reed's brow tightened slightly. Headquarters personnel were one thing. Senior command arriving personally was something entirely different. He turned back toward Caleb Warren once more. The old veteran had finally shifted slightly in his chair, sitting a little straighter as if recognizing the rhythm of the approaching footsteps before anyone else did. His thumb brushed once more across the small metal fragment in the bracelet around his wrist. Reed noticed the gesture and felt the quiet realization settle into his thoughts. The old man had not been waiting for Reed to understand the call sign. He had been waiting for someone else to hear it. The footsteps outside the tent stopped just beyond the canvas entrance, and for a brief second the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Captain Mason Reed stood still near the center of the floor, his attention fixed on the opening where the sunlight spilled across the plywood. Then the canvas flap lifted, and a new figure stepped inside. The effect on the room was immediate. Conversations that had already faded into silence vanished completely. Every Marine in the tent recognized the insignia the moment it appeared. Major General Victor Hale entered without hurry, his posture calm and deliberate, his presence carrying the quiet authority that comes from decades of command. Two aides followed a few steps behind him, but it was clear the general had come for a single purpose. His eyes moved across the tent only once before settling on the man seated quietly in the folding chair. Captain Reed straightened instantly. The shift from casual confidence to formal discipline was automatic. "General," Reed said, his voice crisp. The rest of the Marines in the tent snapped to attention almost in the same breath. Major General Hale acknowledged none of them at first. His attention remained fixed on Caleb Warren. For a moment, he simply looked at the old veteran, as if confirming something that had already been decided before he arrived. Then the general stepped forward across the plywood floor. The sound of his boots echoed softly in the silent tent. Captain Reed watched him approach with growing realization. The general stopped 3 feet in front of Caleb Warren. For a brief moment neither man spoke. The old veteran slowly rose from the folding chair, moving with the steady calm of someone who had stood in rooms like this long before most of the people present had been born. Major General Hale's expression shifted slightly, the stern professionalism of command giving way to something deeper. Recognition. Respect. The general lifted his right hand in a sharp, precise salute. The motion cut cleanly through the air, unmistakable and deliberate. Every Marine in the tent froze. Because the salute was not directed toward rank. It was directed toward the quiet old veteran standing in front of him. Caleb Warren returned the salute slowly, his movements calm and unhurried. For a moment, the two men held the gesture. 2 generations of service acknowledging each other without a single word needing to explain it. Major General Hale lowered his hand first. "It has been a long time, Iron Viper," he said quietly. The name carried through the tent with a weight that no one present could ignore now. Captain Mason Reed felt the words settle heavily in his chest. The general turned slightly then, addressing the room without raising his voice. "Many years ago," he said, "a reconnaissance element operating under extremely difficult conditions managed to guide an entire unit out of a situation where communication had completely failed." His eyes returned briefly to Caleb Warren. The radio stopped transmitting that night, but one man continued guiding everyone home anyway. The general paused for a moment before finishing the sentence. The call sign on that channel was Iron Viper. No one in the tent moved. Captain Reed felt the realization unfold piece by piece. The quiet old veteran in the denim jacket had never tried to prove anything. He had simply answered the question that had been asked. Reed stepped forward slowly, the earlier edge in his voice completely gone now. "Sir," he said quietly to Caleb Warren, "I believe I owe you an apology." Caleb Warren looked at him for a moment, the same calm patience still in his eyes. Then he gave a small nod. "No apology needed, Captain," he said. His voice carried gently through the silent tent. "Some names just take longer to be remembered." And for the first time since the conversation had begun, Captain Mason Reed understood exactly how true that was.